Warna-warni suara anak bangsa hanya di PPI Belanda Podcast. Podcast ini disponsori oleh Transfest, institusi finansial berlisensi yang membantu kamu melakukan pengiriman uang dari Indonesia ke mancanegara dengan kemudahan yang tak tertandingi, biaya terendah, dan tim yang terpercaya. Seluruh operasinya mengikuti peraturan Bank Indonesia dan Pusat Pelaporan dan Analisis Transaksi Keuangan atau PPATK. Dengan kode referral untuk PPI Belanda Podcast adalah 898473.
Hello everyone, welcome to PPI Belanda Podcast. I am Elsa and today we'll be talking about the rich history of Indonesia's gender roles and diversity. But before we get to all that good stuff, let me first introduce you to our guest, Sharyn Graham Davies, an anthropologist who is internationally recognized as an expert researcher and contributor in Indonesia's study of gender, sexuality, policing, and many more. She is currently an associate professor in the School of Languages and Social Sciences, and in addition to that, she's a director of Herb Faith Indonesia Engagement Center. Anyway, I've been babbling way too much, so welcome Sharyn, how are you?
I'm well, and thank you for having me. It's lovely to join you and all of the listeners as well. Not very much happening down under, I'm afraid.
Before this whole quarantine lockdown where we can't really do that much, I understand that you did a lot of research in Indonesia. Can you tell us a bit about it and your experiences researching in this field?
Yeah, so I first went to Indonesia in 1994, which is before a lot of listeners were probably born. So I've been going there for a long time, and I've always been really interested in gender and originally first just roles of men and women, because in my worldview they were the only role options that people had. I grew up in a very traditional kind of place where, you know, the father went out to work and mother stayed home, and this was kind of my world in a sense. And I was really interested originally just to see how Indonesia was looking at gender from this very binary perspective. But it wasn't long after I got there that people started saying, but if you're interested in gender, you know, why are you limiting your focus to just looking at two kind of aspects of the gender spectrum? There's all these other ways of being in the world, and you should be telling those stories and looking at those stories. And so very early on from the 90s, I really became quite interested in this very dynamic concept of gender. And in the 90s, of course, we didn't even really use the word transgender in English. It was, you know, kind of transsexual maybe. We didn't have kind of queer theory. Even gender theory was just, you know, looking quite conservatively at mostly the roles of women. So it was a really exciting time to be involved in these new ways of exploring gender.
I believe that most of our listeners are not aware that you have been doing this research for years and years, in fact. And I think you've lived in Indonesia as well during the time you were conducting your research. Is that correct?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time living there, and particularly, I mean, now, you know, I'm kind of older with a full-time job, and travel is a bit harder in longer term. So they're kind of, I go there for weeks rather than months or years. But certainly, you know, in the 90s and the early 2000s, I could go there for significant amounts of time. And I think during my PhD research that we didn't have mobile phones, there wasn't really internet, and I had a whole year where I don't think I spoke English. I talked to my mum once on the phone because it was, you know, $10 a minute to call home. So it was a really, looking back now, a great way to get in depth with that. It's much harder now because, you know, you've got Google Translate and you've got all of these things that really help you, but they don't force you to really engage with, you know, local cultures and local languages in a way that you had to before a lot of those technologies.
But your Bahasa Indonesia must be really good then.
Well, part of the problem was, of course, you know, when I went to Sulawesi so I did language studies first in Padang, and people, of course, speak Indonesian as a second language, and so there's all local language. And of course, you know, I lived with Bugis families, and Bahasa Bugi was the language that people spoke, and so I mean, that was really good, but it also, I think, didn't necessarily, as someone who's not gifted with languages. And of course, now it's much harder to, I haven't been to, it's the longest time since I first went to Indonesia, almost 2 years now that I haven't been to Indonesia. So yeah, the language is hanging on, but not as good as it once was.
I mean, you say that, but I'm pretty sure if anyone asks you something in Bahasa Indonesia, it just snaps back, you could answer immediately. Especially since our language is pretty simple, I think. I mean, there's isn't like past, present, and future tenses. And also, there's no feminine and masculine kind of nouns, I think, in the way we speak.
Pronouns.
Pronouns, yeah.
I know. People say that this makes it does on one hand, but it's also very contextual. You have to know the whole context. Are you talking? And so I used to get stuck all the time. I was never sure if someone said they're coming. If they didn't expressly say, I will come and get you, I was like, are you coming now? Are you coming later? Have you already come? It just had a whole lot of ambiguities. Simplicity is actually quite complex in a different kind of way.
But I truly think that is a very interesting insight that you said about how simplicity itself is actually quite complex in its being, which leads me to ask you about one of your research, because one might assume that the concept of gender and sexual plurality would be very simple in Indonesia, but it turned out to be in your research titled Gender and Sexual Plurality in Indonesia, Past and Present. You examined the historical evidences such as early travelers' accounts, indigenous manuscripts, and colonial reports as resources. Can you tell us about this paper and the artifacts and what conclusion you could get out of it?
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, one of the things that people often assume about Indonesia is because there's no gender pronouns, there is no she or he. People think, well, gender can't be important. If it was important, you would have a whole lot of, gendered pronouns, him, her, he, she. And it doesn't. But that doesn't mean that gender is not important. It's critically important. It's just expressed in different ways. And one of the artefacts that we have to help us tell this story of gender complexity and the importance of that is from a lot of local indigenous sources. So there's Lontara, which are the writings on palm leaf that tell these stories of the importance of gender mediaries, so people who don't fit into what we might frame as, generally men or women. And we also have available to us a whole lot of sources from people who were visiting from overseas. So Portuguese explorers and missionaries, people from the Netherlands who came. And the earliest source that I'm aware of is 1544. A Portuguese missionary trader person comes and writes about what to him, is this anomaly of Bissu. So these kind of transgender shamans, intermediaries between, the heavens and the royalty. And so he writes about that back, and he's very much trying to convert the local population to Christianity. So that's part of his mission, right, is to come and get everybody to convert to Christianity. But at the same time, there are representatives from the Middle East who are trying to convert people to Islam. And in some of these accounts, it's Bissu, these, shamans who have the power to inform the local rulers who they should go with. Should they become Christian or should they become Muslims? And actually, which would be surprising for many people who think Islam is very disrespectful towards gender diversity, Bissu was saying, no, go with Islam. This is the best religion. This is the one that will welcome us and allow us to live. So, of course, now we know that Islam won out in that. So very early accounts of these different positions.
That is a very interesting piece of information, and it's funny how that all got lost in translation over time. But speaking of the thing you said before about the historical evidences that pointed out that diverse gender roles have existed since ancient times in Indonesia, and most people would be surprised to know that Indonesia's history is actually quite rich of homosexuality and transgenders, which contradicts the common belief that they are Western imports. When do you think it first emerged, and how did it happen?
I imagine there's always been fluidity around gender and sexuality. And so this idea that it was introduced from the West is just so blatantly not true. You know, what the West introduced were laws codifying, you know, who could have sex with who.
And proper terms, probably.
Yeah, and actual, you know, sodomy wasn't, you know, a term until it needed to be invented to criminalize certain people. And we can see the difference, you know, really starkly in the Southeast Asia region when we look at who colonized who. So if we have a look at Indonesia, it hasn't yet, although this could change any day. It doesn't have any laws criminalizing same-sex sexual behavior. So there's petitions and bills, you know, that might be passed shortly, but as I speak now, there are no laws against homosexuality. And that is a legacy of Dutch colonialism, because the Dutch didn't really care what people, you know, consenting adults got up to in the privacy of their own bedroom. They had different projects. But if we look at Indonesia's neighbours, Singapore and Malaysia, you can absolutely go to prison for homosexual behaviour, and that's because of a legacy of British colonial law, where they cared very much what consenting adults did in the privacy of their own home. So it was, you know, the Western ideas of rules, laws, terminology that actually, you know, provided the precedents for what we see happening now in the region.
So what you're saying is it provided a sense of structure, but fluidity itself has already existed for a really long time. But it's interesting because Indonesia is well known to be really conservative and very traditional compared to our Western counterparts. But how do you think this fluidity is able to exist in such a traditional and conservative country that is a little bit full of contradictions? I find it really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's partly why so many people are interested in Indonesia, that it is just not one thing. And while the media in the West at least likes to present, you know, a very conservative image of Indonesia, it's far more tolerant and liberal and accepting than, you know, almost any media will pick up on. And don't forget that Australia has only allowed 2 men or 2 women, you know, to get married very recently. And up until 1994, homosexuality was still a punishable offence in the state of Tasmania in Australia. So, you know, there's certainly nothing particularly progressive about Australia for sure. And what Indonesia does is, you know, at the moment it doesn't, there are bylaws and things, but as a national government, there are not laws criminalising things, but a lot of the rhetoric is very harsh, and we saw particularly from 2016 the LGBT crisis, where, you know, ministers came out and were encouraging citizens to become vigilantes and go into people's houses and report what they saw as immoral behaviour. But on the other hand, you know, within some communities, within some households, there's, you know, a tolerance and acceptance of people for being the way they are. So there's just so many different levels of acceptance in some places, but, you know, hysterical, moral programs of hatred and vitriol really on the other.
About that, oftentimes the articles written by academics and journalists that I research in preparation before interviewing you would often cite examples of historical evidences of Indonesia's fluidity of gender roles and diversity from the Toraja and Bugis tribe, which are both from South Sulawesi, I think. But do you think there is any difference in how those 2 tribes integrate these genders into society, or is it pretty much the same?
I mean, it's an interesting question, and I haven't really thought about that, but there might be something. I mean, Bugis, of course, are really well known for merantau, the kind of going off, particularly for young men, as a rite of passage of going away to other places and coming back, and they're close neighbours with Toraja, of course. So if people from South Sulawesi are heading off overseas and picking up different kind of global discourses and then taking them back, this could have been quite influential in early times, and we know there's some great work being done on the connections between indigenous Australians, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and the connections they had with Makassar. And so, you know, there's been for such a long time these trading relationships between those countries. So it could be something particular about people in Sulawesi and the traveling and picking up ideas and those coming back and circulating that helped produce a kind of a more fluid approach to that. But there's also examples, I guess, from Java, also Bali, so a Hindu influence, and Hindu mythology, of course, has a whole range of acceptance and understanding of different ways of being on the gender and sexual spectrum. So it could just be, you know, that famous cases are coming from Sulawesi, but also from other parts of Sumatra. I don't know of such histories, but again, maybe, I don't know, a different kind of historical link, perhaps to a more, I don't know, conservative type of Islam maybe prevented some of that. So it'd be interesting work for a historian to kind of trace those legacies.
Yeah, but I do think it's interesting how they would specifically point out the tribes from South Sulawesi instead of Java or Bali, which is also incredibly well known for their fluidity in many things. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I guess Sulawesi's become a bit of a famous case, and particularly Bissu, you know, with starring roles in Galigo, and this was a stage production that toured from, you know, Singapore to Milan to the UK, and eventually back to Makassar itself. So I think that's done a lot to put these kind of gender.
Is it the longest manuscript from the Bugis tribe?
Yes, I think.
Wait, is it
Yeah.
Galigo or was it Galigo?
Yeah. Well, so Galigo is the name of the man. So I in Bugis signifies the man. So Galigo is the name of the central protagonist, or the main kind of character in the story. And the chronicle itself, which people say is as long as, if not longer than, the Mahabharata, which is the Indian kind of version, is called Galigo because it's based on Galigo's travels and his kind of connections with Sarawi Gading and other kind of godly figures.
Is there any relation from the Galigo text to is there any connotations of gender fluidity in there?
Yeah, so in the chronicles, so they're originally written on lontar strip palms, and work's been done now to get them into a more, you know, into sources that people can actually access more readily. But in those documents, there's mention of Bissu doing all sorts of things, whether it's communicating with the gods to work out when the king and queen should get married, or when the panen, the harvest, should start. And so there's mention in there of Bissu, and as part of the Robert Wilson's production of Galigo that toured around, Puang Masaidi, Puang Matoa Saidi, who has sadly passed away now, but was the head of Bissu. Saidi travelled around with the production and sat on stage doing incantations and other things. So yeah, the link between Galigo and Bissu is quite strong.
That's interesting. You know, the Galigo manuscript was in Leiden University.
yeah, and if you go to where the KLTRV was, it's Bugis script written on the wall there. So yeah, of course, Leiden's got a really great trove of resources there. And one of my good friends, Kathy Vellen, who is there, studies a lot of this. So she'd be another great person to talk to.
Oh, next person I should talk to.
Yeah, and she's right there. You might be able to see her in person.
Yeah. I'll go right up to her and ask her. But about the Bugis tribe, since the pre-Islamic era, they have divided their society into, interestingly, more than two genders that most society would have divided their gender roles. But in Bugis, they've divided into man, which is called Oroane, woman Makunrai, male woman Calabai, and female man Calalai, and the androgynous priest Bissu. How do you think it happened, and what role did they play? From your anthropological studies, do you think that this impact the archipelago and diversity in Indonesia now in any shape or form?
Yeah, well, I think having words is a really powerful thing. So if you only have words for man and woman, then that's, you can only, it's very difficult to be something if you can't see it. So if you have words about these different categories, it gives a certain type of recognition to that. It gives a naming to that, which can be used for bad ends, but it does also allow people to see themselves and imagine what might be. And so having these terms has been really helpful in many ways. And what it's also done, I think, for contemporary queer movements in Indonesia and beyond is to be able to name something that can give a depth to the argument that gender diversity is not a Western import, because these aren't Western words. These were words there before Western influence started to be seen. So you have these words that are proof, in a sense, of gender diversity and its legitimacy in a pre-Western, global context. So I think that can be quite powerful. I mean, it's also important not to romanticize this and say, a couple of hundred years ago, it was a queer paradise in Indonesia, because that's certainly not the case. There's always an ideal that parents and society want from their children, and it's almost always a very normative one. So there's a idealized role for men, and this is what all sons should be, and an idealized role for women, and that's what they should be. And so it's a danger to romanticize anything about Indonesia's past, because it wasn't romantic at all. It's always been really tough. But I think having words and some kind of way of conceptualizing gender diversity has been helpful in some ways now, in asserting those claims that queer Indonesia has existed for a long time.
Yeah, I agree with that, because especially there's this saying that a pen is mightier than a sword. So it shows how powerful words play over anything, really, if you think about it. But I'm still curious about why the Bugis tribe would divide their gender roles into 5 in total, compared where most society, well, especially before the globalized era, most society would just divide their gender roles into 2, male versus women. But how did this tribe itself, well, not just itself, I'm pretty sure other tribe, but back then secluded from the rest of the world, before globalization, they somehow thought of, we're going to divide it into 5 gender roles. How do you think that happened, and what role does it play really in dividing it into 5? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Like, why do some places have names? So Māori, indigenous people in New Zealand, have takatapui, which is a way of signifying people who aren't normative, cisgender men or women, and other places do as well. Places such as the Balkans, for instance, had a category of it's in the literature sworn virgins. I'm sure there's a much better way of talking about it, but these were female people who may not have had any male siblings, and in order to get an inheritance and to have rights over helping the family do certain things, they had to assume the category of male, because only men could inherit money, only men could make certain decisions, and if there was no boy in the family, then what do? You kind of can allocate this proxy role to female members of that. So there are places where there's that kind of reason. In Indonesia, of course, inheritance is, women can receive inheritance and can have some, quite a lot of rights. So there hasn't been that imperative for that. It's very possibly just that there were people who had one type of body that didn't fit into the usual type of role, and so there was acknowledgement given to that. In English we have tomboy, which is actually used in Indonesia in some circumstances. So that tomboy role is not institutionalized, but it's a way of talking about girls who love doing what traditionally, at least, only boys should have done, and that in a sense has quite positive connotations. Like to be a tomboy, meant that you were quite strong as a girl and brave and did all these cool things. The equivalent for boys, of course, was a sissy, which was, someone who was not brave and not adventurous and not what boys should be. So it could be just a pragmatic response to having the vocabulary to talk about people. But it's a good question, and I'd be great if someone could explore that in depth to see the origins even, of the words and how they came about and what was the impetus for.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, especially since your research paper did bring up a lot of interesting questions. But why do you think the priest's role, which is the Bissu, I think, they would oftentimes assume the androgynous role? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I mean, there's lots of advantages to that role, right, to being a bit of an anomaly. And I found that myself doing field work. On the one hand, I'm a cisgender woman, and so doing field work in Indonesia, I could go and hang out with the women, I could go into bedrooms, I could go into the kitchen, I could do all these kind of womanly things that I couldn't have done if I was a cisgender man, like a normative man. But also because I was foreign and I was traveling on my own, and I was this weird kind of character that people thought I'm more like a man, really. So, I could join in male conversations. I could go out at nighttime. I could do things with the guys because I wasn't at all what, an Indonesian woman should be. Like, you don't travel across the world on your own, really, and you don't, do a lot of the things that it's okay for other women to do. So having that in-between role can be really advantageous. It can take you into spaces that you can't access if you're normatively one or the other. And I think also with Bissu, it's provided them with a space to be able to enter all sorts of places. So one of the comments that one of the early Western explorers noted was that this explorer felt that Bissu were very trusted and they could go into women's circles and in effect, bring the strength of, maleness to protect these women, but they would have no sexual desire for women at all. So, the husbands didn't need to worry about Bissu taking advantage of their wives, but the husbands could relax because the Bissu were quite strong and could kind of protect them. So having, this intermediary role provided Bissu with access to these centres of power that other people couldn't necessarily have.
Oh, so it's like the eunuch?
Yeah, eunuch. Yeah. And part of, one of the stories told about Bissu, and that was told to me and showed to me to prove, was that that Bissu had to be ambiguous. So they weren't allowed to have a penis, and they couldn't have any of, the traits of, a man or a woman. They had to be in between, and only, an androgynous body that was devoid of these clear markers of sex could render someone a proper Bissu. So that's one of the narratives. Exactly
like a eunuch, but only for a more religious approach and with much more higher authority in religion.
Yeah. Although
I guess so.
Some, Bissu who I was able to work with and get to know during my fieldwork say that that's still important, and that has to be a marker of being a Bissu, that you're not male and you're not female only, that you're a mix of those.
But say if from your experiences of interviewing said Bissu, did they get into this role voluntarily, or is that something they were chosen by society?
Yeah, lots of different stories. So for quite a few Bissu, they have a dream. So their stories of how they became Bissu would be that they would have a dream that this would be their kind of destiny, and that's how they started the journey. So you can't just be Bissu, you have to become Bissu through all sorts of training. You have to learn to recite a whole lot of the lontara, the origin narratives, and you have to show aptitude for doing certain kind of blessings and chants, and the makgiri, which is the dance that you do with a sharp bladed knife to prove that you're open to having spirits enter you, which you can therefore do do blessings from. So to start this journey, some people had a dream that just told them this was their destiny. Others, it was a bit more serendipitous, so they might have met someone from the Bissu community and thought, oh, actually that really resonates with how I see myself, and they became included that way and went through the training things. So I didn't hear any stories about parents kind of funneling their children into it. There wasn't anything from that. It was all personal stories of how they were active in taking themselves.
So it's not like a biological thing that they were assigned to by society, or is that sort of both in a way?
Yeah, so for many Bissu, it has to be, your body has to be neither male or female, but both male and female.
Is it a condition you must have before you enter, or is it something if you choose to enter, you have to remove all traits?
I think there's different stories. So for some Bissu, I mean, people tell the story that suits their body, right, and their own experience. And so for some Bissu who wanted to show the world proof that their body was neither male or female and yet both, then that story was that you had to be born like that and you couldn't modify your body in a way to fit that. And for others, you know, they might have acknowledged what looked like a male body with, you know, all of the details of a male body, but inside they felt female. And so the story for them was,
that's interesting,
that they're both male and female, even if they look, you know, male to others, on the inside, you know, their body is female. And so there's different ways that people tell the story of how they combine maleness and femaleness. But what is consistent is that everybody feels that they need to combine those.
Combine both and at the same time not display any specific traits that will point more towards one gender compared to the other. That's good to know, because at first when I was reading about Bissu, I assumed that they were born biologically probably having both genders, because that happened in some medical cases, and then their society would anoint them. Maybe, I don't know, that's what I thought at first, but it's interesting to know.
Yeah, so certainly, so intersex, this you know, a body that is neither or both, has, you know, in the West, of course, until very recently, has had to undergo modification. So, you know, John Money's study back in the day that said, you know, the body is we can manipulate the body and make it look quintessentially male or female, but the thing is you have to make it look like one and not both. And so a lot of children went under terrible surgery to change their bodies and are still living with those consequences. So in Indonesia, there wasn't necessarily a move towards that. And so for some intersex Bissu, then that's a really important part of their identity and their connection to being Bissu.
One mystery solved. Okay, so next question. I was wondering about this one too. Well, to be fair, I was wondering about all the questions that I asked you and will ask you. So, yeah, but the anthropologist, Heti Noi Palm, I really hope I didn't butcher her name, I'm so sorry, said the Torajan people believe that the most important religious leaders in their culture are women, or Burake Tatiku, and men that are dressed as a woman, or Burake Tambulang. Which is interesting because traditionally most religions would have appointed male figures as religious leaders. But why do you think women are chosen instead and are favored so much more? That should a man of said religious belief be considered important as well, they would have to dress as a woman, or Burake Tambulang?
Yeah, well, there's some interesting examples of where women reach these levels of kind of spiritual power. And I don't think the reasons behind that are always necessarily progressive. It can be that women are seen as quite unstable and emotional and otherworldly and not rational and slightly crazy. And so that's why, you know, some women get positioned in this way as spiritual leaders because of how they are as seen as connecting them to a spirit world in not a necessarily positive way. It's a category for, these crazy women to be put into, whereas, for men who were acting the same, that wouldn't be applied at all. But there are some examples of where it is a real status symbol, and men therefore need to emulate that in order to reach those levels of power. And actually for Bissu, there, during my field work, I have only met one, but there are examples that I heard about and in the literature, like the Lontara and things, of ostensibly female Bissu who might have been born as women but have gone through a journey to take on male characteristics. So slightly differently in that men aren't emulating her, but she was seen as given a kind of a position in that. But otherwise, certainly in Sulawesi, the character of females haven't been positioned so highly that I can think of.
Is there any historical artifacts that supports this, or that leads you into this conclusion?
I can't think of any, but Kathy Vellon is the person to ask about that. So she reads her Bugis is amazing, and she's a historian. So if anyone's going to know the answers to that, she would for sure. And she's done a lot of work on kind of marriage practices and things. So I think the role of women might come out in that kind of work. But I can't think of any evidence that talks about women as women in the artifacts or in the literature from early times in Sulawesi. I mean, there's certainly women like Sawari Gading, who was the kind of the goddess who descended from heaven, but the women are always coupled with a man. It's not really something that they do singularly on their own. They're kind of connected more to a family or a community, or starting something together in the presence of men rather than having their own separate status.
Okay. Huh. I find it interesting that most of the time that, like what I said before, most journalists and researchers usually chose South Sulawesi for their source example for diverse gender roles. But is there any specifications why? And can you provide any examples outside Sulawesi?
Yeah, certainly in Java, there's the Warok kind of role. So in a lot of theatrical performances, there's notions of gender crossing or gender diversity in that sense. But I think Sulawesi and Bugis and Bissu in particular have become the most famous in a sense. I think a lot of it because there's been documentaries made on it, from National Geographic to Discovery to Robert Wilson's stage play, and other academics who are working in that space have kind of done that. And also, of course, internally, scholars in Indonesia who are looking both at Lontara and these early traditions and really trying to internally promote Sulawesi in perhaps a way that hasn't occurred elsewhere. And I guess maybe the historical sources are partly the reason for that. And there could be examples of places maybe even in northern Sulawesi or in Roti or in some of these kind of islands, but perhaps the resources aren't available to be able to make those comments.
It's more of like the lack of availability of resources that most researchers are less inclined to take a certain conclusion, because it's quite hard to say if you don't have any solid evidence supporting said claims.
Yeah, I mean, it really could be that. And even for Sulawesi, De Pave's comments in 1544, I mean, if we had lost those are the earliest ones talking about Bissu, for instance, and they could have easily been lost, and we wouldn't know how long the history of Bissu goes necessarily. And so a lot of resources, could have been lost, or visitors who wanted to record that just may not have thought it noteworthy. Depava could have come to Sulawesi and not thought Bissu were worth mentioning at all, and therefore didn't mention them. And of course, indigenous documents, Indonesia is, the climate is so humid that it's hard to keep things. It's not like in Egypt where, stuff that you put there 3,000 years ago is just going to sit nicely. In Indonesia, it's going to be a forest within a few years. So, artifacts and documents don't last in the same way that they do elsewhere. So there could be these really rich traditions across the archipelago that we just don't have the evidence for. Or, of course, they just, there wasn't gender diversity in the way that we're thinking about it now. So it's hard to speculate on that without evidence to support that.
But it shows how good our researchers in our world are to be very fact-based instead of simply just jumping into conclusion without any research at all. So, listeners, this is a very good research. You should all check it out.
Yeah, and a big plug. I mean, there's universities in Australia that are really trying to cut the social sciences, getting rid of scholars and academics in disciplines that speak to these issues in favour of, more hard science ones in engineering. But if we do cut these scholarly researcher positions from university, we're in real trouble, because who then is going to spend the time looking through these artefacts and old documents to be able to tell us what the world was like? And if we don't know about our history, of course, then we're pretty bereft in the present without being able to reflect on that.
Yes, I agree, especially since people often disregard the importance of social studies, where in fact it is actually very important in order to understand the world we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all engineering projects are needed and really important, but if you don't know how people are using a technology or a space, then, your engineering or your architecture or your policy is not going to be as effective. If you can't understand the people whose lives it's going to impact. And that's where, anthropology, sociology, and history are really important. And these are often the subjects that are being cut, particularly now in pandemic times where student mobility is reduced and a lot of universities that relied on international students don't have that revenue. These are the first subjects that get cut, but actually they're fundamental and critically important to what all scholars do in trying to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I fully support your statement. Okay, so even though many have said that the influx of religions and colonialism further enforced gender roles, or for a lack of better term, kodrat, nowadays, in a globalized era where people are much more liberal, do you think that the traditional culture of gender flexibility will fare much better in society? Or like all traditions in itself, it is a dying belief in art? Despite in an interesting way, gender roles are less strict now compared to like 20 years ago or something.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know. I always try to be quite optimistic, particularly, when it comes to Indonesia, and I have always been very optimistic, but I must say that since 2016 I felt less and less optimistic about where the gender space is going. And on the one hand, yes, there are more opportunities for women. There's great encouragement for women in Indonesia and elsewhere to get an education. There's acknowledgement of these kind of pressures of particularly working mothers to be able to balance all of that. And I think women feel that everywhere across the world, but particularly in Indonesia, where it is, as you say, part of this kodrat that women must prioritize husband and children, and then they can do work outside of that. So it's really difficult for women to be able to manage all of that with limited support and social structures to do that. But what's particularly worried me, I think, is that a lot of people who don't necessarily care about what people get up to as consenting adults at home in their own home, they don't particularly care about that, but they want to get re-elected or they want to increase their power base somehow. feel that the way to do that is to have very homophobic comments, very transphobic comments, to the point that, you know, now there's laws before the court that will criminalize not just homosexuality but all sex outside of marriage, that the domestic violence bill that is aimed at supporting women and survivors of domestic abuse, this has been rejected yet again because it's been rejected yet again because people in positions of power think that if women are worried about getting beaten up or assaulted or raped, that they'll just go and have sex bebas, that they won't be able to, you know, have any restrictions on themselves, and so women are still being beaten up and violence perpetrated against them with no consequences. So it's hard at the moment to feel a little bit optimistic about gender equality and the space for women and LGBT Indonesians to exist. And actually in the last few months, I've had 2 petitions from courts in the UK and elsewhere to write expert witness testimony for people seeking asylum, LGBT people seeking asylum outside Indonesia, because they're saying it's just not safe to be there, and that, you know, they should be classed as asylum seekers because their home country is not safe for them anymore. So I do feel a lot of pessimism, but I do then, you know, if you push that rhetoric away, you know, all the Indonesian people I know are incredibly welcoming and tolerant and progressive and supportive of all of this. So, you know, when I get a bit overwhelmed with the policy and political level, I just push that aside and remember all of my actual experiences with, you know, Indonesians who are fighting, you know, really hard to make it, you know, a safe and inclusive place. And then I feel all happy and optimistic
Well,
again.
I think I share the same sentiment, and the fact that at one hand, I'm really pessimistic about where we're going, but at the same time, I also feel incredibly optimistic, you know, because I feel like it's a matter of human rights at the essence of it all, you know. And also, I think that, well, RUU-PKS, first of all, pissed me off really bad. But, yeah, I think it's a matter of human rights when you boil down to it, you know, in its essence, in its core. And people often forget about the human, the individual human in there. And yeah, it's a shame. But I think our society will come around to it, you know. It just takes some time. We've come into the conclusion that Indonesia is a juxtaposition of contradicting facts and cultural contrasts. How do you think gender and sexual plurality in Reformation Indonesia fare nowadays? And how does these contradicting cultural contrasts and facts have somewhat managed to exist side by side in Indonesia until this day? Especially, you know, it's a very conservative country. Well, not super conservative, but yeah, you get the gist.
Yeah, well, this is one of the great ironies of democracy, right? Like, on the one hand, and I was in Jakarta in 1998. I was, you know, locked behind barricades trying to get home each night from people, you know, all the demonstrations, and actually had to have a helicopter on standby. All the Australians were almost evacuated.
I've never rode a helicopter.
That was a pretty...
Oh, no.
I didn't get to go in one. You know, I wasn't important enough to get on it. They didn't mind if my life was lost in the pursuit of democracy in Indonesia. But I'm glad I didn't have to evacuate and stayed, you know, all through that time in 98 and then into 99 as well with the East Timor stuff. Was a pretty crazy time, but it was also so exciting because democracy, right, had come to Indonesia, and there was now going to be freedom of the press, there was Human Rights Commission, there was women's rights on the agenda. And so there was this time of thinking that democracy had brought a lot of great stuff for a lot of people in Indonesia. But what democracy does is it gives everybody a voice, and all of those voices weren't progressive. So the irony, of course, of democracy is that it gave freedom of speech for gender and sexual rights, but it also gave freedom of speech to people who didn't want that to happen. And that's what we're seeing now, is that freedom of speech means that people can push for criminalising LGBT activities. So this is where we're at in the moment with kind of Indonesia's democracy, which is in many ways getting, more regressive, because in any democracy you need a lot of money to get elected, but in Indonesia you really can't get elected without money. And the people who have the money to push their political agenda in Indonesia are the ones who are finding an increase in votes by saying LGBT should not have rights, that women shouldn't have rights. So again, in that political high level space, democracy doesn't seem to be doing what a lot of us hoped it would do for Indonesia. But again, when I look back at, the work of friends and colleagues quietly and consistently pushing for recognition and rights, when I think about all of these people at grassroots levels and other levels, then, my optimism comes back.
I really like your answer, as it is pretty realistic and grounded to how Indonesia has been for quite some time. The bit about Indonesia's politics and democracy is also interesting to see how it all ties together. And I like how you end your statement in a hopeful note, since I think most of our listeners and I too are trying to be hopeful about Indonesia's future, which is a great way to wrap this episode. Okay, so what I think is the main takeaway from this episode about what may be an incredibly minuscule part of our very rich history is that what it boils down to is to simply try to understand something, someone, or an issue that may seem so foreign to our culture, in hopes to understand and grapple with complex questions and dilemmas, by looking back to the past to see how it influences relationships, culture, and society. It is, after all, really important to learn and understand, rather than point fingers. Thank you very much, Sharyn, for becoming our guest for this episode. It's an honor to have you. I learned so much, and I hope all our listeners will learn so much more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elsa. It was a real pleasure. So thank you very much for having me.
I hope you guys enjoy this, and don't forget to listen to our upcoming episodes. My name is Elsa. I'm your host, and I'll be signing off. Bye!